Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. After a few technical difficulties, we are ready to start. Today's talk is hosted by Ludovica Seratrice. It's not within a theme particularly, but it certainly speaks to at least language and literacy, if not more. So I'm going to pass over to Ludo to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Holly. Hi, everyone, and welcome to an impromptu, well, not quite impromptu, but like, a sound talk that is not in any particular theme, but I think in many of our themes. I say education and language and literacy for sure. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Joanna Kolak. So I've known Joanna for about 8 years, I think, when you came to the UK after having done a BA and an MA in Portuguese language and psychology and a PhD in psychology. And in 2016, you came to Manchester to the SRC Lucid Centre. That's where we met, exactly. So you were a research assistant there for a couple of years while you were finishing your PhD. And then you were a research assistant in Salford, where you started working on apps. Right, if that's correct. Yes, I think you'll tell us a little bit more about your personal journey. And then you move on to a lectureship in Salford, and very recently you joined the IOE at UCL. So Joanna's interests are, and also I should say actually before we go into the research interests, Joanna has got, has a very successful academic career, but also an equally successful career as an influencer. Yeah, she's got a massive following on Instagram, specifically because she works with parents of Polish children, I should say mostly, because your content is in Polish. And she's also got like a very cool ebook on 50 questions about bilingual language development. That's also again aimed at parents who want to raise their multilingual children. So you've got like this double life. But obviously, the two things come together because they all sort of load onto this interest that you've got on bilingual language development and how to foster and maintain heritage languages, obviously with a particular interest in Polish because of your own background. Okay, so I think without further ado, I think I will leave the floor to you because you've got a lot to tell us, and I'm hoping you can hear us, and then when the time comes, we will be able to hear you. Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Ludo, for this kind introduction. I'm not sure. Okay, so the camera is capturing me now. I have to get used to it. Just one technical question. When should I stop the talk so that we have time for questions?
Yeah,
about
1:45.
Yeah, 1:45.
Quarter to 2. Yes, perfect. Okay, so hi, everyone. Let me just pull up my presentation and go in the presenter view. Okay, so I will talk to you today about the potential of digital media to support bilingual language development. And this is my plan of the talk. So first, I will tell you about the studies that I have conducted with a group at the University of Warsaw and Jagiellonian University in Poland on bilingual language development in the first years of school. Then I will move on to discussing the educational potential of language in media, so my studies from Salford University. And then I will consider whether we can use media to support bilingual development, what are the strengths of media and the limitations. And I will present to you my pilot study on the Polish-English bilingual children in the UK. And at the very end, I will very briefly touch upon the implications of those studies for bilingual families, for supporting 2 languages of bilingual children with a special focus on heritage language. So as Ludo has mentioned, I have previously worked at the University of Salford, the University of Manchester. I did my PhD at the University of Warsaw when I was actually already based in Manchester. So I was kind of torn between the 2 countries and 2 universities. And I did my 2 undergrad programs in Jagiellonian University in Poland. My main fields of study are developmental psychology and psycholinguistics, so the interplay between language and psychology. And I've got 2 main areas of research. So my first area of research is bilingual development, with a main focus on supporting children's heritage language. In many of my studies, it's Polish. It's my native language. And my second area of research is digital media, with the main focus on the quality of language in media. As Ludo mentioned, I'm a keen science communicator. I don't usually call myself an influencer, but science communicator is what I try to go for. So I try to translate the research findings, not only my findings, but the findings of researchers around the world, to the language available to parents, to practitioners, and also to translate the findings of the studies into practice. So to show the practical implications and sometimes implications for policy as well of the studies on digital media and bilingualism. And I'm consulting parents and companies. I also provide support for teachers and speech and language therapists. So here is some of the some snapshots of what I do. So I've got a website where I provide my products and consultations. Here is my ebook on bilingual and multilingual development that was translated to English. And as Ludo mentioned, I'm mostly targeting parents of Polish children living around the world. So there is a big diaspora of Poles around the world, and the content of my social media, educational social media, is in Polish because I started from a small account. I didn't really know that it's going to grow so much, but I'm also targeting parents speaking different other languages. So I often run webinars for parents that are in English, so not only in Polish. So I'm trying to popularize science in English as well, but I've got this special focus on Polish because of my background. So starting from the studies on bilingualism in the first years of school, the studies that I will focus on today are done in collaboration with Multilada Lab at the University of Warsaw. So this is where my PhD was based, and I still actively collaborate with my colleagues and on various grants and research projects. And our main focus is finding out what is so special about bilingual children's language knowledge and lexical access in their both languages, and based on that, how we can support bilingual children in practice, in classrooms and in the families. And we are very much interested in the support for heritage language, because a lot of studies have been done on the majority language and how we can support children so that they catch up with their monolingual peers in school. But actually, there is still paucity of studies on the heritage language and how do children develop in that language? What do they need from us as researchers? What do we need to find out? How we can support parents and children? So the first study that I would like to talk about comes from a few years ago. And here is a picture of the first two authors, Marta Wójcik and Magda Łuniewska. And part of the data in this study comes from my PhD. So we tested 4 to 7-year-olds, 45 Polish monolinguals in Poland, and 45 Polish-English bilinguals in the UK. And we focused on the Polish language, so on the heritage language of those bilinguals. And we were interested to find out how do word properties, so age of acquisition, frequency of words, imageability, so the extent to which we are able to imagine a word when we hear it or when we think about it, how do those word properties influence word knowledge and also speed of word processing, so lexical access of Polish-English children in Polish. And we were interested in the overall, the main effects of those word properties, but also we wanted to find out whether those effects of frequency, AOA, and imageability differ between monolinguals and bilinguals. So whether maybe bilingual children are more sensitive to those features of words. And we used cross-linguistic lexical tasks developed by Magda Łuniewska. Really very cool tasks. I recommend them if you test bilingual children's word knowledge. So they are designed for comprehension and production between the different languages. They are available in over 30 languages now, I think, and they are designed with the same principles in mind. So they are not each other's translation, but they are designed following a very kind of strict procedure. So they enable cross-linguistic comparison of child's production and understanding of language. So moving on to the results of the study. So yes, so we ran the the comprehension, the production task, where children had to name or identify nouns and verbs that differed with respect to the age of acquisition, frequency, and imageability. And we tested their word knowledge, so how correct they were on the tasks, and also how quickly they were able to either touch the picture on the screen when they heard the name, or say the word in the production task. So we were measuring their response time as well, not only the accuracy. And in terms of the results, so overall, we found that both monolinguals and bilinguals were sensitive to word properties. So there was a main effect of age of acquisition, with words that children usually acquire earlier in life being easier. So children were able to identify them correctly, and also they were very quick in naming them or finding them in the picture. Same goes for imageability. So the more imageable the word, the better children were. And frequency as well. So the more frequent the word, the better children did. But interestingly, we also found that bilinguals were more sensitive to those word properties than monolinguals. So they had lower accuracy in words of high age of acquisition and in words of low frequency, which we can see here. So you can see that when the word was of low age of acquisition, then bilinguals and monolinguals were at ceiling, but when the words were in general acquired later in life, then we can see this effect of age of acquisition. So bilinguals were less correct than monolinguals there. And bilinguals were also slower in low frequency and low imageability words. So here again, you can see that in terms of the response times, when words were of high frequency, then bilinguals and monolinguals were equally fast in naming them or recognizing them in the pictures. But when they were of low frequency, then bilinguals were slower than monolinguals. And similarly with imageability, so if words were high in imageability, if it's easy to imagine them, for example, concrete nouns like table or chair, then there were no differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. But bilinguals were slower when the words were of low imageability. So when they had to name or recognize abstract words. Obviously, we didn't really have very abstract words because they wouldn't be depictable in the pictures, but still the words such as maybe less frequent and a bit more abstract verbs were not as easy for children to recognize and to name. We also found in one of our studies that the context of word acquisition is really important. So we know from many studies today that bilinguals tend to have smaller vocabularies than monolinguals in one of their languages. But obviously, if we calculate their overall vocabulary, then we can see that very often there is no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. But in 2010, Ellen Białystok and her team found that it's not so easy and that we have to be more detailed when we describe this kind of studies. And they discovered that actually when we compare children's knowledge of the home versus school words, so the words that are usually learned at home and the words that are usually learned at school, then we find out that very often bilingual children do similarly in the kind of school words as their monolingual peers in the majority language, but the difference is in the home words. So in the words that bilingual children very often have less chances of hearing in the home, obviously, because in the home they speak heritage language. So we wanted to replicate this study, but we kind of expanded on it. So we expanded on the methodology. So instead of sitting together and thinking of which words are more home and more school words, we actually invited parents and teachers. So we had almost 300 parents and teachers, and we asked them to categorize words into home and school. So whenever we had over 50% of parents categorizing the word as home word and less than 50% of teachers, then we decided that this was a home word. And the same goes for the school context. But when over 50% of teachers and parents identified certain words as school words, let's say, or home words, then we treated them as words coming from both contexts, so overlapping between the contexts. And also, we wanted to test this with respect to heritage language. So again, when Białystok did her study in 2010, they only focused on the majority language. So we wanted to see how it actually is with the heritage language. So here we were comparing Polish-English bilinguals living in the UK to their Polish monolingual peers living in Poland and English monolingual peers living in the UK. Sorry, and again, just quickly about the tasks. So we just used production and comprehension tasks, the picture tests. So in English, it was BPVS and EVT, and in Polish, we used comparable, similar tasks. So we found that bilinguals indeed knew fewer home and school words than their monolingual peers in each language overall. But also when they were split into home and school words. And bilinguals were exposed to these words either only at school or only at home, whereas Polish monolinguals and Polish monolinguals and English monolinguals would hear them in both contexts. But for a small subset of words that bilinguals would hear in both contexts, they showed similar performance to monolinguals. So this kind of supports the findings of Białystok, but extends it to the heritage language as well, and is based on a more robust methodology, potentially, when we think of the ratings of the home and school words that we got from the teachers and parents. So it's really crucial when we think about the vocabulary size of bilingual children to not to assess it in terms of overall vocabulary, but to maybe look at the specific type of vocabulary and the specific context in which children had a chance to hear those words. And then we were also interested in the metacognitive vocabulary. So this is a study that we ran when I was in Manchester. I was collecting the data there from, again, Polish-English bilingual children aged 4 to 7. We had a sample of nearly 40 children, so small-scale study. And we were interested in the different types of words. So not the vocabulary size in general, but we wanted to see whether there is a language gap between Polish and English in bilingual children in terms of the concrete verbs, so verbs such as jump or drink, and metacognitive verbs, so verbs that relate to our mental states, such as think or remember or know or presume. Because again, this group of verbs is not really well researched in bilingual children, but we know that these verbs are really powerful in terms of impacting children's future language skills and also their cognitive skills. So we know from a number of studies that usually there is a cross-language gap in the children's vocabulary. So they tend to know more words in their school language the older they are, but this gap is widening. So the more school words they know, the more words they know in their majority language, the less actually they will know in their home language, because as the majority language input increases, the home language usually decreases, and also their use of home language decreases, because especially in the context of children living in the UK, where the majority language is English. So it's a powerful language of media and present in the general culture, lingua franca, obviously. So it's the heritage language, such as Polish. The heritage languages such as Polish have really difficult job of trying to attract children's attention. So we were interested in those two groups of verbs here. And we used, again, cross-linguistic lexical tasks to test the knowledge of concrete verbs. And we used a tool called MedVoc to test the children's knowledge of metacognitive verbs. So MedVoc consists of this is not MedVoc actually. MedVoc consists of different stories where children would see the pictures and they would hear a story, and then at the end they are asked, okay, so did Adam know that it was going to rain, or did he guess? So there are always two different verbs. So it's like a comprehension test. The children get to know the story, and then they are asked to indicate which of the two different metacognitive verbs would apply in the story. So we test their understanding rather than production of the metacognitive verbs. In terms of the cross-linguistic lexical tasks measuring concrete verbs, we were able to test both comprehension and production, but MedVoc is only developed to test comprehension. Then we also collected the cumulative language exposure data via parental questionnaires. And we also collected data on the amount of parental metacognitive talk when they tell stories to children. So we use the semi-structured narratives, and this is the picture here that applies to it. So we use the narrative task that was developed some time ago for a project disentangling bilingual development from specific language impairment, today known as developmental language delay. So we use the narrative task that the parents were telling the story to their children in their heritage language, and we were measuring the number of metacognitive verbs that parents use when they tell the story to children. And then in our results, we saw that there was a steeper increase in the concrete verbs knowledge in English compared to Polish. So we tested children in both languages. So this is something that we would expect, because as they enter school and they start their education, their concrete verbs knowledge in the language of school, in the majority language, increases sharply, whereas we didn't see this increase for the Polish language. It was it was less steep. Interestingly, we saw, so we can say that with respect to concrete verbs, there was this language gap between the languages. Interestingly, we didn't see this gap with respect to metacognitive verbs. So we can speculate that there is a carryover effect across languages with respect to metacognitive verbs. And also we saw that these two categories of verbs were related to different types of exposure. So the child's cumulative language exposure that we measured with the use of the questionnaire was related to the production of concrete verbs, but the parental metacognitive talk measured when parents were telling the narratives actually was related to the knowledge of metacognitive verbs. We tested this in regressions, so we can carefully say that it affected or influenced the knowledge, but only in the language in which it was provided. So here are some plots in which you can see the steep versus less steep increase in the concrete verbs. So in the bottom right-hand corner one, where we have the verb production on the y-axis. So this is the concrete verb production, and age. You can see that English, which is marked in red, has a steeper increase, and we don't see the steep increase in Polish. But on the left-hand side, at the very left here, we've got the metacognitive verbs, and you can see that there is no difference between the languages. Yet, what's important to keep in mind is that this metacognitive talk is supported by parental use of metacognitive verbs, and it's not really, there is no relationship between the general child's input and the development of those verbs. So this means that probably for a child to develop the knowledge of metacognitive verbs, they need to hear these verbs in the parental talk. So just summarize those studies on bilingualisms. There are some key issues for maintaining heritage language. So first of all, obviously, high quantity and quality of input, but then also for bilingual children, especially for their heritage language, we need to think of the exposure to low frequency and abstract words, and also to metacognitive, to exposure to metacognitive verbs, so verbs related to our mental states. And so something that doesn't really come straight from the studies that I described, but we know it from our other studies that there's just no time to squeeze everything in. We also know that children need to have plenty of opportunities for using language. So not only for hearing it, but actually also for using. We know that in many families, the parents would talk, would use one language to, like heritage language, to talk at children, but children wouldn't really have the opportunity to talk back, or sometimes they would have the opportunity to talk back, but they would rather use the majority language to communicate. So very often there is like a bilingual conversation, parents using heritage language and children using their majority language. So we also know that there needs to be motivation and the real need for language use for children to use their heritage language. So then when being engaged in all those studies, I was thinking whether media, digital media, could actually be an additional source of high quality, maybe abstract, low frequency words for bilingual children, alongside obviously parental speech and language that we have in books. Because media can provide additional motivation, they can be engaging. So there was this growing kind of need in my head to run some studies on the use of media to supporting heritage language. So how are we doing for time? Should I?
Fine. Yeah, you got about 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. Yeah, so I do have to speed up a bit. So then I started researching educational potential of media. And just to give you a quick introduction to the whole relationship between media and language, we know that if children use media excessively over the recommended time, so for, let's say, children aged 2 to 5, that would be over 1 hour per day, this can impact their language skills. So very often it's related to lower language skills. But if there is a later onset of age of onset of media exposure and also high quality of media, so when children are exposed to educational content, when they frequently co-use media with parents, we know that we can see benefits for their language development. And those benefits are observed more so in experimental studies than in observational or correlational studies. We know that electronic books are especially effective, more effective than TV, videos, games, or apps. And from our recent meta-analysis that we wait for it to be published right now, we know that children can also learn more when they co-use media with adults compared to solitary use. And so in my studies, I'm mostly researching touchscreen apps, which are more interactive form of media than TV. TV is more passive. When children use touch screens, it gives them a bit more autonomy and agency to select their activities, to choose what they want to do. And also the touchscreen apps very often respond contingently to children's actions. They elicit verbal replies or actions. They provide timely feedback. So it's very different than the traditional types of media. And potentially touchscreen apps can increase children's motivation, engagement, and learning. But also we have to keep in mind that they are related to more solitary use, because when we sit in front of the TV, very often the family sits together and you can chat with the child, whereas if the child is holding a device in their hands, it's really difficult to actually co-use it. And also we know that the app market is highly unregulated, with over 80,000 apps. It could be even more right now, claiming to be educational, but how many of them can actually be educational? So we know from some of our studies that not many. So very often apps that are advertised as educational actually lack proper educational value. So what we wanted to do when I started working for the University of Salford in Gemma Taylor's ESRC grant, we wanted to create tools for evaluating the educational potential of children's apps, because such tools were missing, or they were developed. There were some attempts to develop those tools, but they were aimed at researchers, obviously using a lot of jargon and not really being very user-friendly. So we wanted to create first systematic tools that would allow assessing touchscreen apps for preschoolers, the educational potential of these apps, but that would be also user-friendly and that could be easily used by caregivers, educators. So we created such tool, obviously based on developmental theory and studies, and also on some studies on children's use of media. But then we wanted to assess the validity of those tools in studies with parents, educators, and app developers. So we used their feedback to improve our tools. So it was a really interesting part of developing those tools, because the feedback that parents, educators, and app developers gave was very different. There wasn't much overlap between their opinions, which was really interesting. So they all contributed something to our understanding of how those tools should look like, what they should capture. But we had to really balance, all the comments that they submitted to us. So we developed two different tools. One is a questionnaire for parents, educators, for general public, measuring 10 different app features that we deemed the most important based on the literature and also based on the feedback from app developers, educators, and parents. And we measure each of those features on a scale of 0 to 2. So there is an overall index of the educational potential between 0 and 20. Very easy to use tool. I will show you an example on the next slide. And then we developed a more kind of nuanced, detailed tool for researchers for quantifying different app features. So basically what you need to do to use both of those tools, you have to use an app for 5 minutes to explore all the options that are kind of easily available to you. And then you assess the app based on that. So for parents and educators, they use the app for a few minutes and then they complete our questionnaire. And then for researchers, they need to capture the screen recording of the use of app, and then they can analyze it frame by frame. So if somebody is really interested in that, they can use our second tool. But for majority of people, we just recommend the first tool. So this is how it looks like for one of the items that we've got. So the items that we've got are like scaffolding, the quality of feedback, quality of language, meaningful learning, and solving problems, for example. So this is the example of solving problems item from our questionnaire. So the app would score 0 points if it does not involve any problem solving, 1 point if it involves problems that are not really mentally challenging, and 2 points if app involves problems that promote reasoning, thinking, and creativity. This is just the first sentence that we have got in all those descriptors, but then it's followed by examples from the apps. So to each grade criterion, we actually give examples from the actual apps, so parents can relate it, they can understand more what do we want them to find in this app. So this is something that the previous tools didn't really involve, the kind of relating it to the actual content and giving examples. And first we tested, so we did the first systematic analysis of the apps available in the UK market. We had 43 apps. We targeted top charts for preschoolers from Google Play, Amazon, and Apple App Store. And we first wanted to see whether paid apps are more valuable than free apps. So is it worth paying additional money for an app? Will it give you a higher educational potential? Turns out it's not going to give you higher potential. You don't have to pay for apps, at least based on the sample that we tested. There were only some minor differences in the aesthetic features of apps. For example, paid apps contained more sophisticated videos, maybe stuff like that. Then we tested educational apps are more educational than purely gaming apps. So from the sample that we gathered from the study that I showed you just now, we identified the apps that had a learning goal or that didn't have a learning goal. And then we compared them, those two groups. So we used our tools that we developed, and we focused on the educational potential by using our tools, and also on the quality of psycholinguistic features. So separately, apart from the tools, we also analyzed the language in apps. So we transcribed the language, we coded it for the utterance length, for the frequency of words, age of acquisition, concreteness, lexical diversity, many different features. So we realized that apps with a learning goal had indeed higher educational potential when measured on our scale, which is great. They included more opportunities for feedback, they had more specific feedback, they had more language in general, and the language was more age appropriate. So they tended to have lower age of acquisition of words, for example. But overall, and I don't have the overall score here, but overall, the apps, none of the apps scored higher than 15 out of 20 points. So and majority of them actually scored around 10 points, 8 to 10. So yes, educational apps, the ones that have a learning goal, that are targeted to teach something, to teach children something, they are more educational than purely gaming apps. So it's a good start to look at whether an app has a learning goal, but it's not enough to provide like a high educational experience. So for example, one of the features that we identified that was missing in those apps was the kind of scaffolding offered by the app. So if the child is, let's say, doing very well with the app, would the app then make the content a bit more challenging? So apps don't really do that. And I can see, so we did this study a few years ago, but I can see in the newer studies that the other features are kind of improved, like this specific feedback, the quality of feedback, the language in apps, but this scaffolding feature is still lacking. So interesting that app developers either don't want to implement it, maybe it's too expensive, or they don't know how. I don't know. AI is here, so we should be able to do that, but somehow it's still missing. And then we also wanted to test what is the quality of language in those apps. So we expanded on Thea Cameron Faulkner's and Claire Noble's study, where they compared the language in children's books with child-directed speech from the core program. And we added those 18 educational apps that we identified in previous study. So from our systematic analysis of apps, the ones that had a learning goal were taken here as educational apps, and we compared it to the 20 top books for children and to the language from 12 child mother dyads from the language corpora. So again, that was like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of sentences, utterances. We coded everything. We coded language in each app, book, and child-directed speech for, again, psycholinguistic features. I love psycholinguistic features. If I test them anytime I can. Lexical diversity, so the number of different words available, and then the number of repetition of unique words, and also the utterance types. So we tested for fragments, so utterances that have no lexical verb and subject, no subject. So for example, things like through the fence or on the wall. And then copulas. So copulas are any forms of an utterance with a verb to be inflected in any way. So for example, it's sunny, she's here. And then imperatives, so these are subjectless requests for the child's action. Go here, don't touch it, come to me. And questions, we all know, and subject predicates, so utterances with subject and verb, and then complex sentences, so utterances that would have more than one lexical verb. So what Cameron Faulkner and Noble saw in their study is that the language by parents is somehow impoverished compared to the language in books, in a way that it doesn't contain a high proportion of complex sentences or subject predicates. So basically what parents use very often is imperatives, some questions as well, and a lot of fragments. So this is how it looks like. That's why we have to read books to children, obviously, so that they can hear those complex sentences. And we wanted to see where do the apps, where we can place the apps there. Are they more similar to the parental speech or to the language in books? So these are, because whenever I talk about this study, people always ask, what sort of apps did you have? Like, what are the titles of the apps? So I included it here just in case somebody wants to see if people have preschoolers at home or they teach children. So these are some of the apps that we included. And as you can see, majority of those apps, of the subsample of the subset of apps that were targeted at teaching children language, majority of them would teach them letter names and sounds. So phonic apps. And then there was one app teaching vocabulary and one app teaching reading. And here on the right, you can see how well did those apps do on our educational potential scale. So you can see the highest scoring app, CBB Storytime, scored 15 out of 20. And majority was around 10 to 13 points. And here are the results. So in terms of the word frequency, we found that apps contained equally frequent or infrequent words as books, but compared to child-directed speech, they had lower frequency words. So apps have lower frequency words than child-directed speech, and they also tend to repeat those words more often than parents. So apps would expose children to words such as badge or conveyor belt or sticker that are of low frequency, and they would repeat those words very often. In terms of the mean length of utterance, so how many words are on average in the utterances, there was no difference between apps and parental speech, but apps had shorter utterances than books. And in terms of the proportion of questions, apps had less questions than books, but similar number of questions to parental speech. There was also similar proportion of complex sentences, very low proportion of complex sentences, similarly to parental speech. And obviously books have more of those sentences. And interestingly, for lexical diversity, apps apps contained lower lexical diversity than parental speech. So even though they contain low frequency words, that they actually don't present the child, each individual app will not present the child with a variety of different words, because they tend to focus on specific words and they repeat them very often. Here is the how apps, books, and CDA and child-directed speech compare in terms of the proportion of different grammatical constructions. This is what I already discussed, but maybe it's easier to look at it on the graph. So, for example, you can see the huge proportion of fragments that apps include compared to books and child-directed speech, and you can also see the tiny proportion of questions that they include compared to books. And the tiny proportion of complex sentence and subject predicates. So apps would basically consist of imperatives or of those requests for the child to do something, like tap here, drag it, open this, close this, and those would be very short sentences, including sometimes low frequency words and repeating those low frequency words. So from what we gather from the study is that potentially we could use apps as an additional source of language for younger preschoolers, but not for older children, because older children need a variety of words and they need complex sentences. But maybe apps could be used by children with learning difficulties, like dyslexic children, or children with limited language skills in English, so potentially bilingual children. Do I still have 5 minutes to talk about the? Yeah, so I'll try to. So these are some of the studies that I'm currently running, and I'm hoping to discover, for example, what's the quality of language in literacy apps used by dyslexic children, what's the quality of language in YouTube videos that preschoolers watch. This is a study that I do in collaboration with Ohio State University. And we are interested in how Welsh teachers use apps to promote Welsh language. So a couple of different studies on language and media. And now, can media support bilingual development? So we know from a range of studies that children with low skills in their heritage language or majority language can actually benefit from digital media. So for example, children with low skills in majority language in certain studies are able to learn more words when information is presented both visually and via audio. So this kind of double channel that media offer, that they very often show you the word on the screen and they also read it, seems to be quite beneficial for children. But also the study that I kind of designed my study, that inspired me to design my pilot study, they found that media diversity, so the number of different media items that parents have at home in heritage language, predicts children's heritage language skills above and beyond media quantity, and when language exposure is controlled for. But the researchers who did this study didn't observe this effect for majority language. So it seems that for majority language, because children are surrounded with it so much at school and in the society, they don't need even more exposure. So if they watch, if they are exposed to media in this language, it's very often redundant. It doesn't really add anything more to their language development, but actually for their heritage language that they hear less often, media might be valuable, especially a diverse range of different media. So So media might be additional context for less frequent words, as I showed you based on my study on apps. They can enhance the message via dual coding. They can scaffold learning to pick up the target information more easily than books, for example. And potentially with a variety of media, we can also expose children to a more varied vocabulary and grammatical structures. These are just some of the hypotheses. Kind of, it's not really tested with many different studies, but this is my starting point for designing studies on how media in heritage language can support children's heritage language learning. So I will very briefly show you the results of my pilot study that I ran. So I had a small funding and I just ran a survey study on Polish-English bilingual children in the UK and on English monolingual children aged 4 to 6. So so the Polish families in the UK, I mentioned them quite often. I devote quite a lot of attention to them because it's one of the largest immigrant communities in the UK, maybe less so after Brexit, but still. And I know from, for example, from my PhD study that Polish parents, at least the ones that participated in my studies, are very much aware of the benefits of bilingualism. So they are really keen to transmit their heritage language. They are very motivated to do so. And we know that by the time children are 6, 7, they score similarly on the heritage language and majority language vocabulary tasks, so in Polish and English, but their heritage language skills are weaker than those of their monolingual peers. So a couple of studies that we run show us that Polish English children very quickly catch up with their monolingual English peers at school, but they need some additional support to maintain their heritage language. And from the interview study that I ran with parents a couple of years ago, they said that they try to use digital media with their children to support Polish, but children prefer media in English because they are more available and they can relate to this media more because their peers watch them and so on. So in the present study, in this pilot study that I ran, I wanted to test whether the quantity of media and media variety, so the diversity of media in English differs between the monolingual children and bilingual children. So whether bilingual children are exposed to similar media than to their monolingual peers. And also, how does this quantity and variety of media differ between the two languages of bilingual children? And then I was also interested to see what is the quality of language that monolinguals and bilinguals in the UK are exposed to in the apps and TV programs. And so this is my sample. So as I said, it was a survey study. I managed to target quite a lot of bilinguals very easily, collected this data in maybe 2 days, whereas collecting data from monolinguals took me ages because, well, we live in the UK, so you will expect that you will have easy access to monolinguals. I know that you probably know that's not the case. So yes, so I managed to somehow get 38 monolinguals. Actually, I got more of them, but then it turned out that they do have some additional languages at home. And then so the mean age of children was 5, from between 4 and 6 years old. And in the Polish families, all the mothers were Polish and almost all the fathers were Polish. In the monolingual families, even though some parents were of different nationality, they always spoke English in the home. And I tested them with the modified QQ-SEED questionnaire from the study that I mentioned on a few slides ago when I said that they discovered that media variety impacts on child's heritage language skills. So I wanted to see whether I can replicate it in this population. And bilinguals also completed a section on language exposure. So first, I just, out of curiosity, tested what was the age of onset of media exposure, and I realized that over half of the children had the exposure below the recommended age, which is expected, knowing other studies. Children don't wait until they are 2, and they are usually exposed to media earlier. But in the sample, the monolinguals were exposed a few months earlier than bilinguals, which is quite interesting and might have to do with like different parenting philosophy maybe between the Polish parents and the English parents. In terms of one of the things that I was able to test in this questionnaire was the perceived importance of media functions for parents. So they were supposed to indicate how important is using digital media in relation to keeping the child entertained, keeping the child occupied, distracting or diverting attention, increasing the knowledge and skills, and communicating with others. So overall, across the whole sample, increasing knowledge and skills was the most important to parents, was more important than entertainment, keeping the child occupied or distracted, which was quite surprising to me because many studies show that actually the main function of media that parents use is to keep the child occupied. And also, interestingly, increasing knowledge and skills was equally important as the communication with others. But then when I looked at it across the groups, it turned out that actually monolingual English parents use media more to keep the child entertained than the bilingual group. And on the other hand, bilinguals use media more to communicate with others than monolinguals. So it's presumably because the bilingual parents use Skype or FaceTime to talk to other family members. And this is how it looks like in percentages. So it's the same analysis, but just to show you, this is the percent of parents for whom this function is very important or important. So as you can see, for 70% of bilinguals, communicating with others is very important when they use media, and less so for monolinguals. So then in terms of the quantity of media exposure, the monolinguals had more exposure to English than bilingual children, which is, again, as I would expect, because I expect that bilingual children split their media time into Polish and English. In terms of the media diversity in English, so the number of different digital items that parents had at home, there was no difference for the between the monolinguals and the bilinguals. So they are exposed to a similar kind of variety of media. And in terms of the comparison between the two languages of bilinguals, so now we are only looking at the bilingual sample between Polish and English. So watching video and TV was the most kind of frequent way of using media. Then there were apps and games on a touch screen, and then it was FaceTime or Skype. And in terms of the distribution between the languages, Polish English bilingual children watched TV equally often in Polish and in English. But for the apps or games on a touch screen, they used English more often than Polish, which kind of is, again, as expected, because they prefer the games and apps more in English. But they use FaceTime and Skype more often in Polish. And this is how it looks like in percentages. So this is the percent of children who use a given type of media daily. So you can see that in Polish, they use Skype daily, 20% of them. So one in 5 children uses Skype daily. And 18% of children use apps or games in English, whereas only 10% of them does it in Polish. In terms of the quantity of media between the languages, children used media in English more than in Polish. And they also used a higher variety of media, higher media diversity in English than in Polish. And this is the final analysis here. So I also wanted to test whether exposure to media is related to language skills. So in a regression, I wanted to see whether what is more important for each language, media diversity or media quantity, when we control for language exposure. So something that previously was done by other researchers. So parents here were supposed to rate the child's understanding skills and the child's language use skills on a scale from 0 to 5. So this is not an ideal way, obviously, of measuring language. This is just my pilot. That's why I wouldn't rely on it too much. But this is just to see whether there is something there in the data. So in Polish, indeed, it shows, so the ordinal regression shows that media diversity, but not media quantity, predicted the use of Polish when controlling for the quantity of language input. And in English, for bilinguals, the quantity of media exposure was more important than the diversity. But again, this is just really, this is a very kind of initial analysis. I wouldn't pay too much attention to those regressions because they are done on a survey data. We didn't really test children's skills per se. And then I also wanted to test the quality of TV programs that bilinguals are exposed to. So this is just to, so I was expecting to see that maybe bilinguals would be exposed to different TV programs than monolinguals, because, well, I wasn't really sure. Nobody ran a study like that before, so I didn't know what to expect. I thought that maybe Polish parents are not able to select exactly the same TV programs as English monolingual parents, but turned out that there was a very big overlap in terms of the most popular TV programs between the two groups. So here you can see the percentage of parents who indicated that they watch a given TV program. So this is just really a descriptive statistics of the programs that both bilinguals and monolinguals were exposed to. So I tried to do the same here that I did in the apps. So I was looking at the proportion of different types of utterances. So fragments, copulas, questions, complex sentences. I didn't run any inferential statistics here because I didn't have anything to compare. Like monolinguals and bilinguals were exposed to exactly the same TV programs. So I just took a sample of each of the most frequently viewed episodes from each of those different TV programs. And this is just really out of curiosity to see what's the proportion of different utterance types. So as you can see, it really differs across the TV programs. Some of them have almost 100% of fragments, and some of them have actually almost 40% of complex sentences, which is quite a nice score. So like the Gabby's Dollhouse TV series, for example, has quite a lot of complex sentences. But anyway, this is just a first step into what might be happening there. And I'm also currently analyzing the quality in the top Polish TV programs that bilinguals are exposed to. Yes, so I know I probably run out of time horribly, but just some tips for bilingual families overall based on all those studies that I presented. Obviously, parents should use heritage language in new contexts outside of home as well, just so that they don't restrict the language only to the home words. So they should expose children to lower frequency and abstract vocabulary. They should use a diverse range of media programs and games. Co-use media with children to scaffold new vocabulary, potentially, if it's possible. Also, because so many parents indicated that they use Skype regularly to talk in Polish, and the child is present there, then they could make sure that co-using the Skype is also a fun, is done in a fun way for children to engage them and also to expose them to wider range of vocabulary. So yes, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. We are at time, but we can maybe have a quick question. If anyone has a question online, do put it in the chat or come on camera. I had so many questions as you go through, but now I've forgotten them all.
I know, and this is probably my mistake. So I wanted to include, more. So my initial draft of the presentation was very slim, and then I was like, we'll add this study and this.
Can I ask one question? When you said, when you asked parents, teachers, and app developers about the important features of the app, and you said that there was a very little overlap. So what is that? I mean, I understand maybe app developers compare to parents and teachers, but what about parents and teachers? What is it that really differed between them?
So the main thing was that parents pointed to a lot of different words that were not clear to them. So one of our criterion was, one of our questions was, tell us which words are not clear to you, which ones are ambivalent maybe, or you just purely don't really know what we are asking about. So they had a lot of comments focusing on, maybe the focus was slightly different. They focused on vocabulary a lot, on those discipline-specific terms, whereas teachers focused more on the actual educational features that we should be looking at. So it's not that they had like very different ideas. Maybe I didn't phrase it very well, but they focus on slightly different areas, which was really nice actually. But it was really difficult to to implement the comments from app developers and parents, because app developers very often would tell us that something is not really possible, like the automatic scaffolding, for example. They would very often say this is not really, we are not really able to do it easily, but this was in 2018, so a lot might have changed in the meantime. And also, to be fair, I don't really remember the exact answers right now, because it was, but it's worth refreshing it maybe and seeing what were the comments exactly.
So would you say that it's this element of interactivity that is difficult to replicate?
Yes. Yes, definitely. So according to the app developers, some of the things that we wanted to implement, so some of the things that we wanted the apps to have were not really achievable from their point of view, or maybe they were not really, it wasn't worth trying. Maybe they would be able to achieve that. That's just my thinking. But if they know that they can make a fun app, we also know it from other studies that developers focus on fun and engagement a lot, and children focus on that as well when children are asked to assess the apps. But parents and educators tend to focus more on the actual educational value of apps. And the developers were not that interested in, for example, cognitively engaging activities, because children, according to them, children wouldn't necessarily be interested in them, because children are looking for fun, which is
or
true.
adults. I mean, people play Candy Crush.
Exactly. Yes. After work, you don't really want to play like trivia, but you just want something mindless. So this is one of the areas that really needs more focus. Actually, one of the studies I would like to run is to bring children, educators, parents, and app developers together and get them fight, get them to discuss how actually those things could be achieved. So they satisfy the end users, which are children, not teachers or parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people now trying to develop apps using AI, but it's expensive to use AI, and therefore it's expensive to buy or pay for the app. So it's this kind of vicious cycle, and probably people making this app don't want to do that, because parents are going to pay £15 a month for like a silly little game, are
That's
they?
true.
So yeah, it's difficult.
Especially for the free apps, right?
Yeah.
If you develop a free app, so you are only relying on the ads within the app, which has, again, the app in one of our criteria, which was called app design. We alluded to those, to the ads, to the pop-ups, to all those things that are disturbing the children. But then app developers didn't really comment on that. They weren't that interested in that. They just said that it's part of the job to have the ads in your app, of course, and especially if you want to release a free app, you have to earn on it somehow.
Yeah. And then I was just going to say about because a lot of them were to teach children kind of early reading skills. I guess you wouldn't expect complex language, would you? You would expect lots of repetition.
Exactly.
And then I guess the words in those are chosen because they contain a particular letter sound. So in some ways that might give you low frequency words, right? Because it has to rhyme with blah.
Yes,
but
exactly.
then you're not going to have all of those other kind of characteristics of complex language, and you shouldn't, right? It's not like that would be desirable in those apps.
You cannot have everything.
Yeah. So if you had different kinds of apps that weren't designed to teach children to learn to read, then it might have been quite different.
Yes, and very often the low frequency words that we have seen, such as conveyor belt, they were really very typical to the specific app that we analyzed. For example, the Peppa Pig app that was very popular, and actually we rated it quite highly because it involved quite a lot of like meaningful cognitively meaningful and complex tasks for children. So that was quite nice. So one of the games was about putting the bags on a conveyor belt. So the narrator would say, could you put 3 square blue bags on a conveyor belt? Very nice app, promoting kind of cognitively active skills, and children have to think about the colors and shapes and numbers at the same time. But then the word conveyor belt was repeated so many times, and it's not even like the strict focus on this app. This app is not trying to teach you the word conveyor belt, but it just happens to be there because it's part of this specific topic, which is quite nice as well. If children don't really travel by plane, this would be probably the first time they are exposed to this word. But yes.
Wasn't Peppa Pig in the news recently?
Japan. Oh yeah, because apparently American parents were not happy with Peppa Pig, right?
because of the language, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
she's quite bossy.
Oh, was that what it
Yes.
was?
She's
It
quite an
wasn't-
assertive pig.
Yeah.
It wasn't the
Showing her
analysis
personality.
of language.
No, I think it was like a little bit bossy.
No, the language is quite okay, but yes, she is very bossy. Not a great role model for a 3-year-old,
Yeah.
but actually this is a typical 3-year-old, I would say,
Yeah.
fussy,
Yeah.
cheeky. So yes, I'm just trying to see if there are any questions on the chat, but I'm not
just
sure if
one
we are.
comment saying
Uh-huh.
go Octonauts.
Yes, I really like the Octonaut app. It also comes with quite a lot of knowledge about the different animals, and yes.
Oh, here's Anna.
Oh, thank you.
Hi,
Hi, can I ask you something, Joanna? Thank you very much. You threw so many data in this presentation. Thanks. I'm going to look for the papers that you reviewed. I wanted to ask you if you have any indication of what the role of the school is, because you mentioned the difference between the use of Polish apps and English apps, even for bilinguals. And I was thinking that here in England, schools recommend apps to parents, so they would be in English, I suppose. I don't know if you have any data on how schools mediate the use of apps in home use, whether these are recommended or whether the parents look for them on their own and whatever they can find on Google and things like that.
That's a very good question, and I haven't looked into that yet, but I'm very interested to find out exactly what you said. So whether the schools are able to recommend parents, to give them some kind of tips or hints what they should be looking at when they look for apps in their heritage language. Very often the apps available in Polish very often are in English. Well, sorry, the apps available in Poland or in the Polish app markets are often in English because they haven't been translated and they are just very popular, like Peppa Pig or Octonauts or CBeebies sometimes. And many of them have been directly translated. So the same happens with TV programs. Very often they are released in English and then translated in Polish. So it's with apps, potentially with many of them, parents could find the equivalent in Polish. Not with all of them, unfortunately. There is a very good app, Teach Your Monster How to Read, that teaches phonics, quite engaging, and we rated it quite highly, but it doesn't really have an equivalent, for example, in Polish.
And it would take true motivation to look for it. Like a Polish parent would want to look for something that is in Polish. Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That could be your impact case study, couldn't it, for REF 2029? Helping teachers to find the right apps.
Maybe, yes, maybe I've got something in progress already.
Right, we better stop at 10 past. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna.
Really fascinating. Thanks everyone online, and see you next time, which will be in April sometime.
I'll let you. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Thank you.
So is it